From the upwards facing Galileo Galilei to the gravitational pull of Sir Isaac Newton. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Jason Byrne.
And I'm Danny Nucci, and this is the What About Podcast.
So, fun story. Those two people I mentioned in the little brief opening there. It's said that Sir Isaac Newton, although contested by some people, developed and came up with calculus at 19 years old.
That hurts my head.
Imagine being the person that came up with calculus. People don't even like to take calculus, never mind develop calculus.
I love that he developed it. He's the godfather, he's the grandfather of calculus.
Yeah, and then Galileo at 19 came up with the idea of counterweights at 19. What did you accomplish at 19?
I could take an apple, and no, I'm just kidding.
You threw the apple at Newton's head that made him come up with gravity?
I could take an apple and carve out a hole in the apple, and yeah, no, I was a mess at 19 years old. More of a mess than I am now, but still a mess nonetheless.
But you are one of the people, and which is why we do this, is that you're curious about stuff, right? You read every day. You're always trying to absorb knowledge. You haven't given up the brain.
No, not as of yet, but give it time. Look, it's doing what I do. You have downtime. Mm-hmm. You have time where you're completely inundated with work and there's no time to do anything else other than learn your lines and get ready for the next day, blah blah blah. And then there's times where you're between jobs or you're not working, and I like to keep it rolling. Mm-hmm. I just loved our next guest. She is an educator, an innovator, the host of Dr. Diane's Adventures podcast, and creator of preschools in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York. Without further ado, Dr. Diane. Well, hello.
Hey.
Look at you with the little vest with your little Dr. Diane's Adventures. That's fantastic.
You got a brand.
You got merch. You're wearing your merch. It's fantastic. I love it. I absolutely love it. Where are you? Are you in Virginia?
I am. I'm in Winchester, Virginia. It's sort of the last little city you can get to before you get to West Virginia and Maryland. So we're all the way north on 81.
You're kind of in the sticks.
Kind of, but there is a little bit of a city here, and we're not far away from DC. But I do have chickens in the backyard. So, I'm living in a city with two chickens.
There you go. The best of both worlds.
Well, Diane, thank you for joining. Diane and I met because she was kind enough to have me on her podcast to talk about some of my graphic novels and how the graphic medium can be used in classrooms.
Oh, right. Of course. That all tracks.
Yes.
Yep.
We didn't have a chance to talk about your journey, though, Diane, which is why you're on our podcast. And I'd love for you to start with how you fell in love with education and where it all began.
Wow, that's a really good question. And it goes way back. It dates back probably to my mom and my dad. My mom was a teacher, and she was, for her time, I think, quite an adventurer. She met my dad in Germany. She was from California. He was from New York. And she had traveled across the world to be a teacher.
Wow.
What was she teaching in Germany?
She worked for the Department of Defense, teaching fourth graders on one of the military bases.
So basically like the kids at the base?
Yeah, she taught the kids at the base.
So my dad was stationed in Germany. What years do you think this was?
She was there like 65-ish, 65, 66.
Yeah, probably when my dad was there. That's crazy.
Yeah, so she would leave my dad on the weekends. He'd be having to work, and she and her girlfriends traveled all over Europe. And, for a woman in the 60s, that wasn't that sense of adventure. You didn't do stuff like that. And she went off and kissed the Blarney Stone. She went to Venice. She would just hop a flight and go places. And I realized much later that I inherited some of that sense of adventure from her.
Sure.
And so much of my childhood, she was a stay-home mom. She stopped teaching after we were born, but she nurtured that sense of learning in us.
She stopped teaching, but she didn't stop teaching you and your siblings.
Exactly.
How many of you were there?
There were two of us. I'm the oldest, and I'm even claiming being the oldest. For years, I spent allowing my sister to be the oldest. I'm like, if you want to be older, go right ahead. But I'm like, nah.
Now you're owning it. I like it.
I can claim it now. But she was that mom that every kid loved, because she would write stories. And so she created, the old radio thrillers with the cliffhangers?
Sure, of course.
she created those kinds of stories on these little typed notes that she would stick in my lunch.
Wow.
Oh, that's so cool.
For a period in 6th grade, I traveled the world with Indiana Jones, and we dug up artifacts in Roanoke in the Lost Colony. We solved problems for the king and queen in England, and she'd work my friends' names into it. So at lunch, everybody wanted to read her notes.
Oh.
And so you had to wait till the next day because you'd get like how is Diane going to get to this next step? And then you'd have to wait till the next lunch.
Well, eventually I figured out where she hid them. And so sometimes I would go and read them.
Oh, that's hilarious. Because you couldn't wait?
Yes!
That's fantastic. That's hilarious. So it's basically you only watch streaming shows. You don't wait for the shows that come on every week, right? You can't do it. It's the same thing.
I have to say, I love a good stream. I like to binge now.
Of course. We can see where it began.
That would have been tough on, like school vacations. You had to wait a whole week. Forget that.
But that was sort of some of where this came from, During childhood, I was kind of one of those feral kids who got to wander around. We lived on a military base in North Carolina, but we had the freedom to ride our bikes. And so I remember being 6 years old and being responsible for my younger sister, who was 1 at the time. And I look back and think, what the heck were these people thinking?
Right. Being a parent now, you're like, wait a minute. That's a lot of responsibility to give a, 3-year-old, 4-year-old?
Yeah, I was 6 and she was 1.
Okay.
But my friends, we all took our siblings around and somehow nobody died. I realized later all the parents did have eyes on us and they had the telephone chain going, but we didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
And we literally were these free range kids who read books, climbed trees, rode bicycles. And I was the bossy one. I created plays that everybody else had to be in. And I was directing them at that early age. But, that's part of what being a teacher is, right? You're sort of guiding and directing play. So it started way back then.
So you're in college. Did you know you were going to go into education, or did you had no idea? You're like most college kids, which is, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to start here. At what point did it turn to education?
It started to shift to education sort of my senior year in college. I went to American University and I was majoring in political science and journalism. I'm finally using the journalism with the podcast. It only took me how many years?
Mm-hmm.
You get it when you get it, they say.
Exactly. But there was a thing in the back of my head going, you'd be a good teacher. You ought to be thinking about teaching. But, I'd already gone through 4 years. I wasn't going to ask my parents, hey, can I stay a couple more years and do this? And it was about the point that AmeriCorps, the National Community Service Act, came through. And I had gotten involved with a bunch of other really cool college kids, pulling all-nighters, using that love of poli-sci, lobbying for what can we do to make a difference in our communities. And so we were storming Capitol Hill. We were making nice, or at least pretending to make nice with folks like Jesse Helms to get them to try to listen to us. And when that passed, if you go and look up New York Times, I'm actually the girl standing next to Bill Clinton in the signing of the AmeriCorps legislation. I managed to get myself up to the front. Long story, but I wound up there, but I kept thinking there's more to life than being in DC. And I wanted to go home to North Carolina and I wanted to make a difference. And so I talked my way into working for the AmeriCorps program on the state level back home in North Carolina. And as I was spending those couple of years working there, I'm working with early childhood programs and with teachers, and it just kept hitting me again and again. You should be doing this. You need to be in a classroom working with kids. And so after I got married, I met my husband through this process because my roommate and coworker was dating his best friend at the time. So
as these things work, yeah.
We're still good friends, all these many years later. But, it worked out. She introduced us and we wound up in Charlottesville, Virginia, of all places. And, I've got time on my hands. I'm trying to figure out what's next for me. And there's this really good little university in Charlottesville, Virginia. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, the University of Virginia.
Yeah, no, I've heard of it.
And so I thought, I'm here. Why not? And so I applied and they had a very small master's of teaching program and I got in. And that sort of is where things shifted for me.
So even then, when you applied to the school, did you still not think, well, this is where I'm going to keep going? Like you weren't sure if education was the right move yet?
At that point, things were building up and I thought, yes, this is what I want to do. I want to be doing education. And I was really lucky because I met some just amazing people. My advisor shared my love of children's books. If you can see behind me, you can see that I've got tons and tons of kids' books back there, which is part of what I do now. But she recognized that love and she recognized that I loved the little guys. Like I had done student teaching with the older kids, but she managed to set me up so that I wound up doing my dissertation work in a preschool. So after I had taught elementary school for a couple of years, she lured me back in. She's like, you should be doing more with this. You've got more to give with this. Come back in. And I'm like, I have 2 small children. Why on earth would I do a doctoral program? And she's like, trust me.
Because you got that I want to make a difference gene.
Yes.
And I think I have finally paid off the debt of gratitude I owe my husband for all the laundry and the kid camping and everything else he did during that era. There was a lot of red wine, a lot of late nights, and a lot of trying to juggle all the different balls in the air. But I learned so much, and I realized, particularly with the little guys, that they can do so much more than we give them credit for.
And they see so much more than we give them credit for. They absorb so much more than we give them credit for.
Absolutely. They're sponges. They are optimistic.
And they're not jaded, which I love.
Yes.
They've got this great capacity for seeing the world the way it can be. And for them, I loved working with that group. And so to give you a little bit more of the journey, I had been doing all of that work. I did my research, actually looking at poetry in preschoolers and how they responded to it. The answer is they like anything, basically. Kind of like that old commercial.
They like Shel Silverstein.
They love Shel Silverstein,
Yeah.
but they'll do narrative poems. They'll do haiku as long as the teacher is engaging and gives them stuff to play with and connects it.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's got to be the full package.
The whole thing.
I still remember from kindergarten, the letter people.
Yes.
Remember them? It was like blow up balloons. Like it's so amazing how like these little snippets of learning can stick with you. I'm 45 now and I still think about those letter people that, were probably part of a curriculum for a couple years and then disappeared.
Well, and some of the most amazing teachers that you had, the little bits that you learned way back are still with you today. Schoolhouse Rock.
Yes.
The best.
Still, yeah.
I can still sing I'm Just a Bill.
I'm just a bill. So let me ask you, at what point did you go from, you know what, I want to improve these curriculums. I want to make a change. I want to evolve how we teach these kids. I want to start creating programs that are going to be more effective based on my own experience. Like, when did that sort of start to take hold? Because essentially that's what you've evolved into.
Yeah, you weren't happy just being in a classroom and teaching somebody else's curriculum, correct?
No, and that actually, I will say it really started when my youngest, Ella, was 3 years old. We had moved up to upstate New York, and you want to talk about living in a place that was isolated. We were 40 minutes from anything. Like, closest town was Poughkeepsie.
Yeah. My sister lives up there in Troopsburg, and when I visit, it's just like tumbleweeds.
It's like all these super cute little towns, but if you want to go to the grocery store, it's 20 minutes away. And so we were in one of those little towns. We had moved up there because my husband had a job at the prep school, one of the prep schools up there. And the preschool closed down.
Oh.
And I have this kid who's preschool aged. And the nearest
preschool that Ella was at.
The preschool she was at, after 30 years,
what did they close? They're like, we can't do it. You know what? We're done.
They decided it wasn't profitable, basically. They're like, there had been one school and they're like, nope, we can't do it.
And was it a private school?
It was a Catholic school. They were the only preschool in town. And I thought, And so my best friend at the time looks at me and goes, girlfriend, you've got the degree. Do something about it. And you figured out by now that I can't hear those words and not do something about it.
Challenge accepted.
A pattern is evolving here. Yeah.
And so I got lucky. The Episcopal church in town, the rector at the time was like, hey, our basement is yours. Use it, turn it into whatever you want. And because we were under the auspices of the Episcopal church, I didn't have to go through all the red tape. And so that allowed me this laboratory where literally for the next 8 years, I worked with 40 to 50 preschoolers a year. They would come in different days. Some came in 5 days a week. Some came in 2 days. Some came in 3 days. I got to test all of the stuff I had learned through teaching, through my stuff at UVA, all the best practices to go, okay, what works, what doesn't? How can we make this an area where it's play-based, where kids are exposed to beautiful books, where they're exposed to community members, and where they're learning? And we didn't have the word STEM or STEAM back then, but that's what we were doing.
But where's the I mean, that sounds like, I mean, obviously you can't do it by yourself.
No.
You have to have some help. It's now your project. How did you fund this? Was it did the church help?
The church let me live rent-free until we started turning a profit.
That's fantastic. But what about books and supplies and teachers?
So I was sneaky.
I'm not shocked by this, by the way, when you say that. Go on.
So we furnished the initial stuff based on the school that shut down. I hired immediately 3 of the teachers from that program to work as assistants.
And they were all too happy. How much preschool work can there be in that area?
There wasn't a lot. And I was appalled at what they had been making at the old preschool because they were literally making minimum wage, which at the time was $7 an hour. Mm-hmm. And to me, I was like, no, that's not acceptable. So I doubled their wages when we started it so that it was more of a living wage because I wanted them to be able to work. Yeah. And I wanted them to stick around. That was really key to me, is they needed to be able to stick around.
Well, and you touched on it earlier too, Diane, is that when teachers are engaged, the kids are feeling that engagement. And if a teacher is worried about paying the bills all day, how are they going to be fully engaged?
Exactly. So I wrote grants to support what we were doing so that, because I believed in scholarshiping, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be a financial barrier to any family or any kids. So there was a generous foundation that wound up supporting us in part for my entire tenure there. I also got the parents involved and the families involved. And so started basically a PTO for preschool. Invited them in for evening programs and after school stuff, but got them, they became my fundraisers. They were the ones who helped me organize these scholarship fundraisers. We did silent auctions. We did a yard sale, basically, where people brought in their used kids.
Bake sale, the whole 9.
I did all of it. My favorite actually was when we did sort of the kids' clothing, and it was a big rummage sale. And people brought in their old kids' stuff and the books and the toys because we all know we don't use it very often or very long. And so that wound up being really profitable. And so we were able to live on more than just tuition and fees, built relationships with the elementary schools so that as I was sending these kids to them, I'm also sending them, Jason can do all of these things. He knows his letters and his letter sounds. He knows, well, I'm giving you credit, Jason.
Thank you.
Knows his numbers, can do rhymes, has these strengths, has these skills, maybe needs some extra support in building friendships, but you're going in with an entire
profile
folder on each kid.
Yeah, you're like a really in-depth profile that will help the kid.
And my babies are now, my very first class are graduating college this year.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And the preschool is still there. I'm not there any longer, but they're still running and they're still thriving in the heart of Millbrook. And that for me was sort of where this great love of kid as scientist, the great love of STEM and STEAM, and that respect for what little kids can do stems from that.
What about kid scientists?
That's a great segue, Diane, because this is our topic this week, which is kid scientists. Can you give us, for those who don't know, what the acronyms STEM and STEAM are and basically why they're important to learning, essentially?
And also, if you could touch on the debate between the two. No, I'm just kidding. Not that part. I'm just kidding.
We could go miles on that, Danny.
That's why I was joking. I'm just joking. Go on. Sorry.
So, the acronyms themselves date back to about the early 2000s. It's science, technology, engineering, and math. Later on, we added the arts. And truthfully, I say it's what good education is no matter what. Whether you're talking about STEM, whether you're talking about STEAM, you're talking about teaching people to make connections. You're talking about harnessing creativity, helping people to be able to collaborate, to communicate. I don't know about you, but I want kids to be able to problem solve because we've got a heck of a lot of problems out there that need solving. And it's more than just teaching facts these days. We need to help them learn how to think and how to have compassion, how to work together. And STEM and STEAM, whichever way you want to go with it, they can help lead to that.
So let's start off with the basics of what you as an educator see as a kid scientist, because I wanted to make sure that people aren't picturing like a 7-year-old in a lab coat. Like we're talking real world applying of this idea,
or some very good Saturday morning cartoon.
I'm now feeling like we need to order lab coats for every 7-year-old on the planet.
Sure.
Yeah.
What a brilliant idea.
I mean, it's a great uniform rather than a little tie and a little sweater.
I see it as being somebody who's curious, who has that love of discovery, who's able to get their hands dirty, who asks why. How many 2-year-olds do you know who ask that question, why? Mm-hmm. Why? As grown-ups, we get tired of it. We want a whiskey. We want to get away from the whys, but those whys are so important because they're trying to figure out.
And if you go up a little bit, 2.5, 3, you're getting why and no. The combination of the two is devastating.
True. But the whys are so important because they're trying to figure out patterns. They want to know how the world works. And that's where we as grownups can sort of help scaffold opportunities for them to explore, allow them to take safe risks, allow them to get their hands dirty and try to figure things out, help provide those resources. And then as they get older, hit those questions that are curious and be willing to say, I don't know the answer. Let's find out. And that's part of what it is too, is it's being willing to get down with the kid, get dirty and figure out, okay, I don't know. I'm not that smart, but let's figure it out.
Well, let me ask you this. So obviously you've been doing this a while and you've been able to impart this information on educators. And I guess I wanted to hear from you, like, one of the first times where you actually saw what you were trying to teach and share being applied in a way that you had envisioned.
You know what? I can give you a really recent example.
Please.
I was in a classroom this week out in West Virginia, and it was third graders, and they were learning about animals. And it was so magical because they brought me in my Dr. Diane persona to talk about the difference in animal classifications between animals in Antarctica, Australia, Iceland, and home. And I always use home because I want them to start from a reference that makes sense for them. Penguins are really cool, but very few of us get to see penguins.
Oh, we have penguin questions.
I have lots of penguin answers. We'll get to those.
But go on.
I showed snippets of video, and then I had them start classifying. And I gave them sort of headers where I always use pictures and words when we do this stuff. And I had them sort of sorting, and we started with, which animals lived in Antarctica, which ones lived at home. Then we got deeper, and I said, okay, now you guys figure out a way you want to sort them. And they had sort of different options. And they're like, ooh, let's do wings and feet. And so they start going through the cards and trying to figure out wings and feet. And then they're like, well, what about wings and feathers and feet? And then they start running into, wait, there are some that have feet, but they also have feathers. And where do we put those? So they're starting to think on a higher level. So then they're like, wait, how can you have feathers and feet? And so they're starting to ask more and more questions. Mm-hmm. So we were able to have them talk in turn and work with their friends. They start figuring out more sophisticated ways to sort. And then they're like, well, wait, how do these animals move? So then I had them move like animals. So we played. And how often in third grade do you get to play and start moving like an animal?
Right.
So I was able to show them alternate movement, simultaneous movement, diagonal, like all of these different ways that animals move. My favorite is the camel, where they move side to side like a ship. And the kids They're walking on the carpet. They've got other people following them. Their teacher is in on the act. And so then they're able to go back and start resorting, thinking about, oh, okay, I've done it now. This is how these different animals move.
And that's the letter people. They're going to be thinking about this when they're 45 going, I remember that time I got to walk around the classroom like a camel.
And then we took it to the next level. We talked about habitat, what does an animal need to survive? All of these. And so we talked about, you need air, you need food, you need water, you need shelter. So then I gave them an apply it challenge. I'm like, okay, all those penguins and those stories I've told you about penguins, we're bringing penguins to West Virginia. How are they going to survive in West Virginia? What kind of habitat are you going to build? And so literally using aluminum foil and cardboard tubes and all the junk I pulled out of my basement, they built the most amazing habitats for these penguins, complete with air conditioning and shelter and cooling. And they gave the penguins enrichment. They created little tiny krill for them.
You basically ruined the teachers moving the rest of the year. I mean, you just ruined it for them. They're like, wait a minute, when's Dr. Diane coming back?
But it was so amazing because they took it all and they applied it. And then they went one step further. Because they were able to do this collaboratively, they then had to create their own animal and figure out how they would adapt that habitat then for the animal they created. So we took it all the way up and they could do it.
Let me ask you this, Diane, because I always was curious about this. And I know you've been to Australia, you've been to New Zealand. When you're in West Virginia and you're talking about penguins and the platypus, which is probably fascinating to a kid from West Virginia.
Yep.
When you go to Australia, are they like, tell me about the gray squirrel? Like, are they
oh
like,
my gosh, our
as
deer are fascinating to them. Like I'm sitting there looking at wallabies because the wallabies are like deer. They literally build fences to keep the wallabies out of their gardens. And I'm thinking, that's the coolest thing. Let me take a picture. And our guide is rolling his eyes at me going, you realize these are like your deer, right?
Yeah. Oh man, that's fun.
Yeah.
It's all perspective sometimes.
It is. I was walking in the woods thinking I could give a guided tour to folks who aren't from around here, showing them our squirrels and our muskrats and our deer. And maybe people would pay for that.
There you go.
Dr. Diane's nature tours.
There you go.
When it comes to exploring the world around us, I'm curious what it takes for parents and educators to do that for our kids in a safe way. Because I'll give you an example. My son, who is 11, we have winter break here, and we just let our son go to New York City with his friend and his family. And we were very nervous, me and more so than my wife. But at the same time, I know it's good for him to go out there and explore. So how do we as parents and educators open up those doors while also still making ourselves feel good about it? Because it is nerve-wracking to send our kids out into the world as scientists.
Oh, heck yeah. I still get nervous about the 21-year-old who's studying on Long Island. I don't think that ever ends. But I do think that we start when they're young, and we start by letting them explore using the 5 senses. It starts by going to the park or taking a walk in your city, letting them explore, giving them safe spaces to be able to explore and to test their boundaries. And then as they get older, we expand those boundaries. And so, you're not going to start by setting a 2-year-old free in New York City, as tempting as that might be.
I don't know. You watched your sister when she was 1 in North
Carolina.
Yeah. Well, so this is interesting. So in terms of this, like I harken back to the times. I harken back.
I like that, Danny.
Wow. I don't know where that came from. I really don't. But nonetheless, there I am harkening back. And I think of those times where it was a Saturday and there was no events, right? So eventually, there was sporting events and birthday parties and all that. But there was those Saturdays and those Sundays where there was a large chunk of time and I was at a loss as to what to do for and with my kid. And so I guess, can you speak a little bit to that? Like if somebody came to you with that question, what your recommendation would be in the spirit of Kid Scientist?
So part of that is let them be bored. That's controversial, but I do think that
I like it. Go on.
If you give them a chance to be bored, they're not going to be bored for long. They're going to figure out how they're going to start figuring out the world around them. You know, you send a kid outside into your yard, for example. Send them outside with a hula hoop. Send them outside with a magnifying glass. They're going to eventually figure out how to use those things, and they're going to come back in going, hey, Dad, look at this really cool six-legged creature I just found. Or, did you see that cobweb over there?
Mm-hmm.
You know, let them practice being bored. I think as parents, we want to be entertainers, and we think it's on us to have to entertain all the time, and it's not.
I'm like that in real life anyway.
But it's one of the hardest things for
Yeah.
us is because we like to entertain.
But you know why that's more difficult now, Diane, too? And I saw this with my son as he was growing up because he watched these YouTube videos of parents who play with their kids all the time.
All the time!
We felt this pressure of like, oh my God, we have to be the crazy parents that are... But I loved being bored as a kid. That's when I found my passion is in those moments.
And I think we have to do that. You know, yes, we do play with our kids. And I'm not saying don't play with your kids, because I think that that's also an important component of it. You know, don't be afraid to get down on the floor.
No, you're talking about balance it out with allowing them to be bored. And make that okay and make that something that can be positive rather than some kind of problem.
Exactly. You know, and also read to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's another component to this. You know, the nighttime reading, the reading picture books, the reading stories. You get a chance to open their eyes to places that they've never been. You know, again, thinking about the kids in West Virginia this week. They may never travel to Antarctica, but if we're reading stories about Antarctica,
Mm-hmm.
they get to travel. You know, we're very quick to jump to YouTube videos and putting on the tablet for a 2-year-old. And honestly, it's not really age appropriate.
Especially once the recommendations come, right? It's like, oh, you're watching this, here's some other videos. And then if left to their own devices, they're going to find things that are more damaging than good.
Uh-huh. And I think that there's got to be sort of that balance. You know, with my own kids, they'll tell you now that, oh, we missed that stage because mom somehow managed to just forget that that existed. But there were things that I deliberately just kind of left out of the equation as part of making them bored. But I don't think that they suffered from it. Neither of my kids, full disclosure, neither of them is a professional scientist, neither is a STEM person now, but they were exposed as kids. And one of the things I was going to say is, you know, by opening up doors to this, you're not necessarily saying you must be a chemist, you must be a zoologist, you must be an astronaut. But you're giving them possibilities.
But you also, to be an artist, I come from creative space.
Yes.
It's so much more helpful to know the world around you, to be able to draw things, write things. Yeah.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. As a citizen of the world, we've got to be able to think critically, and we need to be able to know how to put the things together to understand science. And by giving kids exposure at a young age, maybe you're nurturing a passion they didn't know they had. Maybe you're preparing them for one of the careers that doesn't even exist right now. Or maybe you're giving them the ability as a grown-up to be able to go, oh, that doesn't pass the smell test. Maybe I need to do more research to figure out if this is accurate or not.
Also, just learning what research is rather than overwhelming, looking for answers. It's actually a process that can be enjoyable and, breaking things down and, diminishing the possibilities so that you get down to the core is an incredible skill in life.
Very much so. And you're setting people up for a lifetime, I think, of joy. Because if you've got that kind of creativity and the problem solving at a young age, when you're our age, the world is still fun and exciting, and there's still more to learn and explore, and you don't have to get old.
Well, and Danny, I would imagine that as an actor growing up, you were still a kid scientist because you were studying human nature and just how you interact with people, and in order to then go out and play those roles.
I was just a mimic. I would literally watch a movie or see something, and I would just literally pretend that I was that thing or that movie or that character.
Still research, though.
That is research, though.
Yeah, no, certainly. No, you need to be inundated with material for sure. But yeah, that was basically the root of it. Dr. Diane, I have an audience question that I'd like to ask you. And this one's from Tamra K. And Tamra wants to know, when we don't, capitalized, have the answer to a question that our children asks us, what is the best approach? Lie. No.
Oh, I'm so glad she asked that. I learned the answer to that when I was running the preschool. I had a child named Andrew who was way smarter than me. And Andrew was obsessed with animals. And he would ask me questions like, how many bones are there in a giraffe's neck? Do either of
I
you
have
know the
no
answer?
idea.
I do
It's
not.
got to be 112.
I know now. It's 7. It's exactly the same number we
Wow.
have. They're just a whole lot bigger. And that was the question that literally almost broke me because he was the kid who asked all the questions and I didn't have a cell phone.
Did he know the answers? Was he just testing?
He wanted to know. He didn't know the answers.
Had he figured it out already? It's like, let's see what Dr. Diane knows.
He didn't know the answers, but it came from a place of genuine curiosity. He was dying to know. And so what I learned with him was not to lie, but to go, you know what, Andrew? That is an amazing question. Let's research it together.
Let's check it out together. Yeah.
And so I would say, it's going to take me a day or two. Let me go. And I have to say, I did get my first smartphone that day because I realized Andrew was going to require answers that were going to require me to have a little more information at my fingers than I currently had. So I ditched the old BlackBerry for the smartphone that day. And we would look things up. And then I would say, okay, well, we found it here. Let's see if we can find it in at least 2 other places. So even when he was 4, I was trying to help confirm, we're not going to go to the first site. Let's try to find something reputable. So I tried to model out loud what my process was as I was researching so that he would learn. And then we started playing with stuff from a hands-on point of view. So, you can actually make it real for them. Okay, so the stuff that we found says that a giraffe's neck bone is this big. How big is that? How many shoes is that? Can we find a shoe that's that big?
They love comparables. Kids love comparables.
Yeah, so put it on their level,
Yep.
but be willing to be vulnerable and say, I don't know, but let's find out.
That's interesting, Diane, because you bring up the phone, which it's so amazing that we can get any bit of information we want in the world in this little device, yet you give it to a kid and that's not what they're looking at. So how do you balance technology and knowledge and learning?
I think by starting with the hands-on stuff. When they're little, start with the reading the books, start with the real world experiences. And they don't have to be expensive experiences. It can literally be walking in your neighborhood. One of the things I love to do with really small people is take out like a hula hoop and put it in the front yard and give them a magnifying glass and see how many different things they can see just in that hula hoop. And so you're taking the world and you're really zeroing in on something. Start with small stuff.
Yeah, because it's easy to overlook so much in this life when we're all moving at 1,000 miles
and it requires taking that step back, and it requires sort of going, okay, we're going to take a break today. We're going to take a moment to just stop and appreciate. But little things like that, taking your kids, you don't have to end your world just because you have kids. If you have an interest in art, drag them to the art museum. Don't necessarily expect they're going to go through every exhibit on every floor, but pick 1 or 2 things and stop and really appreciate the 1 or 2 things and ask questions.
Yeah. My daughter and I had an interesting experience last night. We were at a big box store for office supplies, and they were giving out glasses for the upcoming eclipse, which was really cool because you're going into this place expecting just to go and grab something and come back out, and it opened up a door for conversation about science that I didn't expect to have. And I think there's always moments everywhere that we, like you said, with the hula hoop, you can find things in learning opportunities everywhere.
Exactly. You just have to be willing to stop and pay attention to what they're saying.
Before we let you go, as promised, we want to know. Well, actually, it's Jason was going to ask this question, but I'm asking it for him. Can you talk a little bit about how penguins became important in your life?
Absolutely. So it does start with that same sister I talked about earlier. She was obsessed with penguins when we were kids. And I've always loved penguins. When I ran the preschool, we would talk about habitats, and I would create dramatic play spaces where the kids would be able to live in Antarctica, or we'd be in the rainforest, and we would decorate the windows and they would put animals in the different habitats. So 2 years ago, I was at the beach with my dad, who was 80 at the time, and he had been watching Good Morning America. And they had just sent one of their reporters over to Antarctica. And he looks at me and goes, "That looks really cool." I said, "We should go." And I was kind of being a little bit of a smartass, to be honest. And about 3
Yeah, not your number one destination,
well,
Antarctica.
I thought it would be cool, but I never in a million years. I thought it was going to be something that I'd be doing many, many years from now, right? And 3 weeks later, he goes, "Hey, you want to go to Antarctica?" I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Seriously, it's on my bucket list. You want to go to Antarctica?" And I'm like, "Sure, Dad." And so he signed up with the Rhodes Scholar Program, which is sort of travel for senior citizens. And he invited my sister and I to go with him. My mom had passed away 6 years ago, so we're his travel companions now. And so I got to go to Antarctica. And the whole time I'm there, I mean, it's an amazing, amazing experience. I love Antarctica because it doesn't belong to anybody. It's all of ours. And so I love the science. I love the fact that we're really working to focus together on STEM and STEAM and doing things that hopefully will save the planet, looking at climate change. And
yeah, it's fascinating. You go to a research station up there, and there's people from every nation in the world that are all working together for one goal.
We can do it. We really can, people. And so it was just amazing because they're very controlled because they're trying to protect this pristine place. And so when you go, only 50 to 100 people at a time are allowed on the mainland. And to see a penguin up close, to hear them do sort of the Gentoo penguin sounds like a donkey. They have this amazing bray. And for the longest time, I would dream in penguin. Like I literally can still hear them. But to realize these just fascinating, amazing creatures who have their own culture and their own way of doing things, it's magical. And it captures the imagination. And I kept finding myself thinking, okay, we love the things we care about and we protect the things that we love. How do we translate that to kids so that something that's abstract and not part of their everyday experience becomes something they can love? And so that's part of what I'm trying to do with my travels right now is to every time I go, I try to think about what would a kid want to learn? How can I turn this into something kid friendly? And so that's where I'm putting together these videos and I'm incorporating it into the teachings I'm doing both in classrooms for kids and also in professional development for their teachers.
But what's amazing here is that you're doing it for the classroom, but I can tell 100% that your inner kid scientist is loving it as well.
Oh, my inner kid scientist is totally geeking out. And I've discovered I have this huge passion for all things penguins. In Australia, we discovered totally different penguins. They have the tiniest penguins in the world. They're the little blue penguins. They're about this big. I guess if you're listening, you can't see my hands. Know that it's the size of my water bottle. They're like not even that big. If you've got time for a really cool story, I have to share this one because I'm so fascinated by this. On Phillip Island, which is about 90 minutes south of Melbourne, so it's southwest, they have a colony of blue penguins. And in the 1980s, they had only 8,000 of them. And there were summer houses on this peninsula where these little penguins nested and they were dying out. They basically said, in 10 years, you won't have any more little blue penguins.
And was this like a situation where this was the only place in the world they nested? Is that the idea?
They nest in a few other places, but this was one of the biggest colonies. And so they didn't want that to happen. And they did the magical thing that's hard for us humans. They actually compromised. And so the citizens who were living on the island got together with the scientists who were sounding the alarm bell and the government in Australia and said, what are we going to do? And they came up with this plan that involved buying up 150 summer homes on that part of the peninsula while still nurturing tourism on other parts of the island. And they paid fair market for the houses. People were allowed to live in the houses until they died. So it wasn't like we're going to evict you tomorrow. You have time. And they got rid of the foxes that the British had brought over with them because, the British like fox hunting. They're not natural predators. And as a result, they were killing off a lot of these little penguins. They redid the whole area, brought in scientists, returned it to nature. In 2017, it became fox free. In the 1990s, they had all the houses. and they currently have 40,000 little penguins, which is the largest colony in the world. And every night, people are able to go and quietly watch the penguins raft ashore to find their babies. It's called the Penguin Parade, and it's one of the most magical things you could ever experience.
Fox free since 2017.
Exactly. I want to be the person with the job who monitors the cameras to make sure no foxes are getting back on the island.
Sure. Swiper, no swiping. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Diane, how can people listen to your podcast and follow all things Dr. Diane?
So I'm on Insta. I'm on all of the various things at Dr. Diane Adventures. You can find my podcast. It's Dr. Diane's Adventures in Learning, and it's on all of the places. So please check out drdianeadventures.com.
Thank you so much. What a treat.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I love your podcast. Every week I learn something new.
Thank you. Thank you.
Us too.
That's the plan. Kid scientists right here.
Awesome.
Oh man, JB. I gotta tell you, it made me want to have a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old again. I mean, I was like listening to her, just foaming at the mouth. I want to go back and just go, this is what I want to do with my kids. Cause I wasn't like, I would, with one of them, my older, we'd spend like hours and hours at the park, but it was like literally handball, basketball, tennis. Like it was just constant movement. And then my younger one did not like being bored at all. And so, it was like, okay, what do I do? So the little one, I played a lot of like adventures where I was like, we were characters.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of being able to go back with them and, employ some of these, suggestions is just, it makes me miss it. It really does.
What's so fascinating is, as you just said, I wish I had a 2, 3, 4-year-old. I heard your wife in the background go, huh? Yeah, I mean, so in terms of like this like idea of learning, it's one of those things that I've always loved to do with my kids. My daughter is 7 now, and she just did this experiment where she put all these different liquids outside overnight to see if it freezes. I hybridized daylilies, which I'm open to be poking fun at me. I get it, but
I have no idea what you just said.
Hybridize daylilies, you crossbreed daylilies, and then after a couple years.
First of all, what the fuck is a daylily?
Daylily is a flower, a very beautiful flower. And you crossbreed the different varieties and you have no idea what you're going to get.
When are you doing this? I don't understand. When does this happen in your life? When do you sleep? What is this?
When the daylilies are in bloom in June and July is when I do this. And then you collect the seeds in the fall and then you just replant them. That's all. But what I'm saying is, from the upwards facing Galileo Galilei to the gravitational pull of Sir Isaac Newton. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Jason Byrne.
And I'm Danny Nucci, and this is the What About Podcast.
So, fun story. Those 2 people I mentioned in the little brief opening there. It's said that Sir Isaac Newton, although contested by some people, developed and came up with calculus at 19 years old.
That hurts my head.
Imagine being the person that came up with calculus. People don't even like to take calculus, never mind develop calculus.
I love that he developed it. He's the godfather. He's the grandfather of calculus.
Yeah. And then Galileo at 19 came up with the idea of counterweights at 19. What did you accomplish at 19?
I could take an apple. No, I'm just kidding.
You threw the apple at Newton's head that made him come up with gravity?
I could take an apple and carve out a hole in the apple. And I was a mess at 19 years old. More of a mess than I am now, but still a mess nonetheless.
But you are one of the people, and which is why we do this, is that you're curious about stuff, right? You read every day. You're always trying to absorb knowledge. You haven't given up the brain.
No, not as of yet, but give it time. Look, it's doing what I do. You have